Hi, Sophie. Hi,
Hi,
everyone. I'm Anna Veprinska, and I wrote Spirit-Clenched. There it is.
and I'm Sophie Anne Edwards, and I wrote River Rights, or the river wrote it. Some anyway, there it is.
Great. Sophie, so I'll begin. First of all, I obviously, as you already know, I loved your work. I think it's a striking work, and I'm wondering what inspired you to create it. And could you also speak to why the river is a central image in your work?
Um, well, the whole this entire project is focused on the Kagwang River on Manitoulin Island, and I guess I just took to heart this question of what could a river's agency look like. For a bunch of years, I had done environmental arts education and getting people out in different ecosystems and learning about the land through by asking different questions and doing different sorts of engagements. And I really wanted to do that myself and engage with the river myself and going through a process of trying to learn about the river. Part of it comes from my background in social sciences. I have an unfinished PhD in critical geography and familiar with field practices and how you go out and you listen and walk and just do different things. And I wanted to do that with a river, and it's very close to where I am. So I was curious about a number of things. One of them was about how can I learn about the river through creative methods and just by being there and through my body. And then that extended to questions of what would the river say if it could speak in English, which it can't, but if it could speak, and it does speak. So I just curious about how I could listen in different ways. So I just started spending a lot of time out on the river and doing different drawings. And I'm a visual artist too, and I do installation work and all kinds of stuff. But so I just started spending out, and it started to evolve, and then it became a thing about. Well, I guess well, I don't know. I don't know. I just wanted to spend time on the river and just be there, really.
And I love how it's called river rights, as in the river is the embodied thing or the subject doing the writing in this. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I wanted to position the river as an agent.
Yeah, and I think there's some overlap with our work in terms of that. I think we'll discuss as we go on for sure.
Um, yeah, and your work of people. I was saying I didn't my copy. I guess because of the pandemic, it didn't get in the mail. So I was sent a and I you can see I read it multiple times. I'm not lying when I say I very much love the work, and I agree. We have these resonances between. And I'm curious. We both in both our works are talking about language and writing in some ways. But so I'm curious about your reference to language and writing being, as you write, all cheekbones and blind spots. Um, and I'm wondering, is writing somehow an illness or a hope that it's also a bonfire at which the subject or the writer burns her hands?
Okay, thanks so much for that question. It's so Ada Limon has this like quote in one of her poems, and she says, "You understand, right?" And it's such an interesting, just like address to the reader. And I feel like your questions kind of, I guess, understand the work, which is a real gift to a writer, because I love the way you combine like a number of poems in that question. And one of them, of course, is the one about language, and then there's one about bonfires and one about hope and illness. And so there are a lot of ideas in that question. So maybe I'll address them one by one and sort of bring them together. So in terms of language, I think maybe I can read that poem. It's very short. If that's okay. Language, a cubist painting, flaunting the angles of the letter I, all cheekbones and blind spots. And so I was thinking about what happens when we say I, and how that word, the dialectic word, when I say I, it's so different from when you say I, or somebody else says I. But all we have are these faulty tools of language in which to refer to the subject or ourselves. And I was thinking about how often when we say that I, there's such a focus on our own perceptions, our own desires, and there's almost this blind spot that somebody else is also an I. You're also an I. And it's, yeah, so I think in language sometimes we don't turn around to see the blind spots in the same way we do when we're taught to drive. So I was thinking about those ideas. And then in terms of hope, and this comes from a different poem, the metaphor of the bonfire, and how there's the doubleness of fire. It's something that can provide warmth, but it's also something that can burn you. And just isn't that like also part of the creative process? Isn't that also part of publication? You hope for that warmth, you put it out there in the world, but you can also get burned. And so the language and the hope are all kind of intermingled there. And I guess like that brings me to illness. And this metaphor of fire, I recently took this pain management course, and in it they gave this example, and I think it's a widely used example for why pain can be beneficial. So if you're at a stove and you burn your hand, that's your body telling you move away from the stove. So in that case, pain is offering you something there, and there are people who don't have the same pain receptors, who don't notice. It's a very small percentage of the world, but there are people who don't have that, and they can get very hurt because they don't have those pain receptors. And so I think this part of this project is contending with that way of thinking about pain, of it as something that can offer you something. And I think hope and illness and language, they all have that power to hurt, but also that power for warmth.
Mm. Right.
Yeah. Okay, let me. The question is all written down, so if it's just an awkward transition, that's why. So I love the physicality of your project, especially the structuring of these images as postcards. What made you choose the postcard form? In creating the postcards, did you intend them to be dispersed or mailed? And if so, to be mailed individually or as a whole project? And just as an aside to that, I actually, when I received River Rights, I got one of the images on a postcard signed by Kate and Danny. And so it's so interesting how your project can be used for that very kind of, I guess, like historical mail tradition, but mail is in the post office. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, there's lots there. I guess part of it is the analog piece of it. I really like the hand being in it, right? And I think dispersal, that word is important, because the postcard piece of it is really the most recent, I guess, iteration. It's really, to me, I think of it as a project, and these are almost in a way documentation, or they're postcards from the river, not necessarily from me, because if I extend the metaphor of the river writing or this sense of agency, but because the project has been going on for a couple of years, and the work I had started by, like I said, doing drawings, or attaching things to myself and moving, and having the drawings being created by movement and interpreting that as lines, as poems and lines, and then I would draw the movement of things and take that as lines, and then I started actually dropping cardboard letters into the river, where I would write poems and install them for it to be changed. And then I started having the river and putting letters, the alphabet, out in different places, and they would get dispersed or changed. So the wind might move them, or deer would walk over them, or they would float. Yeah, that one, for instance, which is letters I dropped from. I climbed up a cedar tree and dropped them into the snow and documented. Went back every day or regularly over, I think it was 2 or 3 months, and it would change. And eventually, that part of the river, during the spring freshet, it filled with water and the letters dispersed, and I don't know where they went. So it's really sort of, it's process and movement and change, and they aren't static at all the way something is on a page. And it's difficult to document. I mean, you're only getting a piece of it. And even what I saw, and I saw more of the process than what you see in the postcard. And even what I saw was limited because it was continually unfolding. So when I was talking about this with the wonderful women at Riot, we were talking it through, and I mean, it could have been bound, but I really loved the idea of them floating, like the river, things where they don't have necessarily a start and finish, and they weren't in an order. And I'd have different poems out there at the same time, and they're all happening at at their own pace. So it's not linear. So we were just playing with that idea, and Anne Carson, and I'm not in Anne Carson, but I don't know if you're familiar with her book.
Of course.
And you can read it in different ways, and I really like that idea, especially, as I say, this being about an ecosystem and a river. So we decided on a number, and so what you have in your 5 images, there's every envelope is different because they all had a different set of 5 that were sent out in each envelope. And so they happen in different orders. You can move them around, and they're dispersing. And then whether or not people send them out as postcards is up to them. But that's again another dispersal. So I sort of feel like it's part of a longer process of this poem, or these poems being created and dispersed, I guess. Yeah. So I don't know whether I don't know whether people are mailing them out or not, or how they're engaging with them, but I kind of like the not knowing, and that they aren't really finished. They're still moving around.
So interesting is this idea of letting go and the author not being, I guess, having the final say on what the meaning of their work is, and just letting it out into the world, which of course happens with my book and with all literature, but it's very visible in your project, this idea that they're combined in any which way, and then whatever the reader does with them is kind of a part of that story and part of the the creation of that project. So it's really interesting, and I loved your anecdote about climbing up the tree and dispersing the letters. I don't know, it makes me think of childhood, and who else climbs trees but children and artists, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's true, because I was doing all sorts of stuff like that, actually lying in the mud, or paddling around, and I never knew what I was going to do. But I was going to say too, in a way, I mean, your book is bound, but because I didn't get the physical bound copy, I ended up in a way engaging yours, because I printed it out and I was pulling it apart and looking at it, and it got all, I made notes on it, and it's got stains and stuff. So yours became very hands-on for me as well. And I guess that's part of me. I just have to get my hands into things, I guess.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
So yeah, and yours, and I guess this connects in a way that my work is very physical, and there is the body in yours, and it is very physical as well. So there's a bunch of, I pulled a few quotes that I like. So in your piece, you write that skin is petaled, a prayer is fleshy, land is flesh. It's full of these crossed, these porous relations and references. I'm interested in these interrelations between the body, writing, prayer, and the land. And then I also did a little digging, and I found your book, Empathy and Contemporary Poetry After Crisis. And I didn't read the whole thing before this, but I read a little bit. And in that work, you're exploring empathy, and quoting Butler, the primary vulnerability to other, and empathy being how we feel into and between each other, which I think is really relevant to my project too, which really resonated with me. And then the tendency of observers to project themselves into that which they observe, and I quote that from your book as well. So I'm wondering if you could speak about your thinking about empathy and those relations in Spirit-Clenched, and these porous relations between body and prayer and land and empathy.
Thank
Big
you for
question,
that.
sorry.
Thanks for that question, and thanks for looking into my empathy work as well. So I'll start with the idea of porousness because I actually think that's such a good way to think about it. And the body is so much a part of this work. And if I could just take a moment, I'd like to read what I wrote to Gap Riot when I first submitted the
Yeah,
chapbook
interesting. Yeah.
about it, and it was my way of trying to understand the work. So I wrote, the poems in Spirit-Clenched take root in the body. The body in these poems is alternatively and often simultaneously chronically ill, sweating, wrinkling, filing taxes, and confined to an apartment during the current pandemic, where she sweeps the floor in search of connection. The chapbook's concern with the body recognizes that emotional and mental states, whether anxiety, isolation, yearning, or shame, originate in the body and dictate how the body encounters the world. And I think writing this project really did, like in that final line, help me understand that everything, I guess, all our thoughts and our feelings, they're all moderated through that body, like all come through the body and often articulate themselves in the body in ways we don't necessarily notice or or don't necessarily expect. And I think this year especially, we've had to really contend, or I guess since 2020, we've really had to contend with our own bodies during this pandemic because there have been fewer bodies with whom we interact. And so I guess there's this, there's this focus on the body in the work because, and it's not at all like I think I mentioned the pandemic or referred to the pandemic in maybe like two poems. So it's not a pandemic response piece, but it's a piece that recognizes the body in this current moment, which happens to be a pandemic moment. And I think, so I think land is part of that. I think where you're positioned is part of that, where you eat and expel and love and colonize. And this relates also to your work. So I think it's all a part of that. And in terms of empathy, so the book you mentioned, Empathy in Contemporary Poetry After Crisis, it came out of my PhD dissertation. And I spent something like 6 years with that work. And when you spend that long with a work, it's hard for it not to become an obsession, and it's hard to shake off that obsession. So of course, empathy is in this work as well, and these ideas of porousness, of vulnerability, are in Spirit-Clenched. And I guess it also goes back to that image of the fire. Because if we think about fire, of course, as the doubleness of warmth and hurt or burn, empathy is also a doubleness. And this is what I talk about in the book. Empathy can offer warmth, it can offer validation, it can offer connection, but it can also offer hurt. It can offer appropriation, ventriloquy, compassion fatigue. So there's this doubleness in empathy that's very similar to the kind of tensions I explore in some Spirit-Clenched. So thank you for that question.
That's interesting. Thanks for that.
Okay, I'd like to ask you, I'm wondering about the poetic editorial choices you make in the images you capture. For example, why are some shots black and white while others colored? What does it mean to drop letters on the earth? How do you choose what an image includes versus what it excludes? And I know that this is a sneaky many question, but feel free to answer any of those.
Well, the easiest one to answer about is the color black and white. That really had to do with limitations of what the press could manage for color. So, all the images I took were color, so it was a question of finding the ones that would do all right in black and white. And so yeah, part of it was simply that. But in terms of the actual image that I frame of the in-process poems, it's tricky because, like I said, these are long poems. They go on for sometimes minutes or months, and some of them are still going on. I don't know where they are. Some have been removed by people, other walkers, which is a whole other question about people thinking that the place should be quote unquote wild, which is, or natural. I'm not going to go on to that, but so some of them have been removed and I don't know where they are now. And then others disintegrated or have gone down the river or whatever. And so how do you capture an entire, essentially that becomes a question of, it's the entire ecosystem working on it, right? Because the wind doesn't have a boundary, the deer that's crossing over and making tracks and changing the poem, it moves along and it comes back and it comes back at different times, it's at its routine every day or whatever, but you can't track an entire ecosystem. So there becomes a process of editorializing or making a choice, framing something. So when I was taking the images, I was really thinking about it as, I think when I started, I wasn't even really thinking about publication. I was documenting what was very a personal project. It was really a communication between me and the river. And I was documenting the process and trying to find, capturing the images that would show how it had changed over time. And trying to, so all the images that you have, each of the images that are in the packages have tons of different pictures that I would take at different times. Multiples at a set time and then others over months. So it was just showing them change. So I'd sometimes try and get the same framing. So it would show over time, or I would track where it went. It really depended on the piece. There's one with otter tracks. I had been going onto the river and then I noticed, how, well, otters will play and and I was following the otter, God, I'm tired today. I'm not having hard times with words. Anyway, they slide through the snow. So I was following the otter slides, and there was one between two hole, where it was coming in and out of its burrow, and so I'd laid letters along the path where the otter went, and then I tracked that. So I just decided to frame it from entry to entry, so I could see how it changed. So a lot of it was really just responding to the movement of the piece itself. And like I say, just trying in some way to capture the process. I'm trying to remember, what else did you ask? Oh yeah, what does it mean to drop letters on the earth? It's a lot. There's a lot in there for me. One is the question I already mentioned, the piece about wanting to invite the river to collaborate with me. And then that became, thinking about the river as editing my work, but then also co-writing or writing. And what does that mean? And who's a reader and who's a writer? And that all sort of flipped around, and it was really questioning that. And it was also touching on different layers of, I guess you could call it grief. One was I was dealing with a lot of grief, and I guess in some ways I still am. And when you're in the depths of grief, there's that inarticulate space that you get into. You can't find words, and I was unable to put words to what I was experiencing. And then it was the grief, thinking about climate change, the climate crisis, and every time I was at the river, just thinking about this, and then thinking about how, poetry really, there's the limits of what I could do. And I'd done for years this very process-based, community-based practice to build connections to ecosystems, and with the intention of building, a sense of stewardship and connection, and realizing that this kind of stuff, this quiet process-based work, it's so important, but it's just not, it's not enough, right? And feeling that kind of grief, and not having words for that. But then also there was a layer of grief about, and frustration about, not having the language to express what I was saying, because I'm not a biologist, so I don't have that kind of language. And then also knowing that as ecosystems change and as society changes, we're losing words because we don't know place and ecosystems in the way we used to, and just grappling with this incapacity to speak, and then also wanting to open up to a different kind of language and a different kind of relationship. And the river doesn't speak in English, obviously, so the letters became really more like a code or a gesture, and and a way to track process rather than language per se. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that right. So anyway, so that's what it was. It was dropping letters onto sort of as a signaler code for all these other things that were going on for me, but also trying to understand how could I collaborate with the river and listen. And so it's code for listening, I guess. And I did have somebody ask me, what does that mean ecologically to drop letters in a river? But then I was thinking it really, it's in some ways it's less, it's like public, if we publish letters on a book that's bound, that's dropping letters on the ground, dropping letters in an ecosystem, because we're taking those trees, the paper comes from an ecosystem and it's printed on it. So it's enacting it in a different way, I guess. And I was always really, it's cardboard letters or little wooden letters, and it made me be very conscious about my steps and what I was doing in the ecosystem too. So it was also code for me about walking in a different way. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Oh, very much so. Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's so much physicality in your work, and that comes across. So, yeah, thank you for sharing all of that and kind of the process and what led to the work.
Yeah, and again, we cross over in this physicality. Mine was very physical in the sense of actually going out on the river, but as we said earlier, your book touches on the body a lot, and I want to just ask another question to you, propose another question to you about that. So for you, is there a difference between work that's physical and work that's embodied? Again, because like I literally use the body to create lines, and you're very physical in the language in your book. So, and I'm just curious, do you think there's a difference between work that's embodied or work that's physical?
Okay, I think that's a really interesting question, and yeah, I've spent some time with it and thinking about it, because I think in a way it's a dangerous question, especially for a poet, because I think in metaphor and I think in embodiment, but there is a difference between the physical body and the representation between an idea, even if that idea is embodied, and the body itself. I don't think I'm very good at that distinction. And I think I've run into like problems with that distinction. And so, for example, I'm a very clumsy person, and I've gotten better with that, but I used to just like knock into everything all day long because my mind, it was all about the ideas, the emotions, and that's where my focus always was, and the body was always secondary. And part of that, like, has been me like grappling with chronic pain and chronic illness because I guess trying to understand the importance of the body, something I never paid as much attention to, as opposed to like the embodied ideas that I'm like always thinking about. And so, yeah, for me, it's been a very fraught relationship with the body, and learning to listen to the body, and learning that the body has just as much weight and importance as what goes on like up here and in here. Yeah, and so I think, I mean, when you said like I'm tired today, or when you said your work comes from like grief, those things they announce themselves in the body as well. They're not just things that you feel. The feelings come from that body. Yeah, and so that this idea of embodiment versus physicality is something, yeah, I've grappled with.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask you something. I'm just trying to find my question. Okay. You mentioned that the project isn't finished, which I thought, yeah, was really interesting. And you've alluded to that in our conversation as well. Is it something you continue to work on? If so, what does it look like today? And if not, or if so, what else are you currently working on?
Yeah, yeah. So, in one way, it's not finished because, well, one, I'm still engaged in the project. I don't feel like it's finished, and I don't think it'll ever be, because I don't think I'll ever fully understand the river or the ecosystem, and I don't think those questions are resolved. And then it's possible there's still a few poems being worked on out there. I don't know. I think, and there definitely some have gone out into the bay and things washed away and whatever. So I think they're still being worked on. They're not finished just because I don't know where they are. So in those ways, it's still continuing with its own agency, its own directions and whatever. And I really don't have a clue what's going on or how it's being worked on or being
Is that
edited.
hard? Is that hard to lose track of your own work, your own poems?
No, that part I really loved because that was what I wanted, right? I wanted to release it and I wanted it to be worked on, and I didn't want it to be mine, right? Mm-hmm. In that way, I really wanted to, like, at the depth of the grief, like I literally wanted to submerge myself in the river and just, okay, I'm here, like work on me. Let me, this be my final, like, like, sorry, that's rather morbid, but what was your question? No, I wanted that because I'm very, all my work is very process based. So when I was doing curatorial work and inviting, it was all land, folks doing site specific land based work. My work in community is process based, and my visual art practice is process based. So I was really interested in how can a writing project, and we tend to think of poems on the page as being, more static or placed on a page. And I was curious, I wanted to explore writing as process-based. And so that part I loved. I did get a little frustrated when people were removing poems. But that's part of it too, right? Like, humans are part of, they're other creatures and they have their own agency. So yeah, that part, no, that didn't, no, I was fine with that part. And in some ways, the harder part for me is actually finishing this, is how do I put some edges on this so that I can, because like you say, you get obsessed with things, right? As we do as artists and writers. And, this has been a couple years already. And it's gone in phases. There was a period during the pandemic when it was closed and I couldn't go. And I had been very close to the river at the time. I was going once or twice a day, and very, very long process of going back and forth and listening. So I knew what to do next. 'Cause I didn't know, I wouldn't go out with knowing what I was going to do either. And a lot of it was very responsive. And then it was closed at the pandemic, and that shifted things because I couldn't go there as much, and so the relationship changed. And then since then I've become the carer for my mom, and I'm a little bit more housebound, and so it changes. And this project is very much about my body and being there, and it's also, the larger project is also engaging with the landscape, and it's or how we construct landscapes, so that you can't go into an ecosystem and not address what constructs that landscape in terms of colonization and cultural things and social and like human people, walking on that place. So there's these complexities that create an ecosystem or impact an ecosystem. And I've been engaging with those as well. So there was a phase where I was doing more of that sort of more text-based writing and research as part of the project. So now I'm kind of thinking, how do I stop this or put some edge on this as a project, and it'll still do its own thing, or I may go back to it. But yeah, I've lost the track of what the question was. But
no, you've answered it brilliantly.
Okay, so I have a question for you. So I guess you're telling my questions are all over. Here's another one. So you write, the body penned a book, which is the biggest view. It's very much, I could just say, the river penned a book. So I think this is why I'm tapping into these particular questions. It just resonates with me where I'm at right now. But so that phrase that you wrote, the body penned a book, the body's not external to us, but this phrase both extends beyond like a hand actually penning a book, and writing and the agency, the writerly imagination, and it extends to the body. And connecting to loss before, I'm not sure the phrasing of my question, but it speaks also for somehow to me about the loss of control in the face of illness and death, in which we are written by illness and death. So it's like with the river, I felt like I was being written and I was writing it, and in a way, I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but so it might just be metaphorical, but that phrase in your work seems to signal a shift in authority. So I was wondering if you could speak to that and what you're exploring, these kinds of shifts and descriptions between, who's the author and who's writing.
Thank you for that question. You're right, a lot about the body today. And that particular poem is about having a severe allergic reaction. And I guess what happens when you feel out of control in your own body. And I think when we're healthy, we have this sense of control over our own body that shifts when we're ill, because illness or the body becomes that authority, and especially when the illness is autoimmune, because if you think about what that word means, it's the body attacking itself. And so in that, the body becomes almost as if it's something external to you. It becomes something confused. It becomes a potential enemy, something that attacks you. So I think those ideas are part of the body penning the book here, the body doing the action. I went to this incredible empathy conference once when I was working on the dissertation, and the scholar Jackie Scully was there, and she said that we often hesitate before empathizing with a body that is disabled because the distance between ability and disability is a set of stairs. And I always remember that because it reminds me of this idea that this is just one, it's only one kind of disability she's talking about, and there are so many others, but this loss of control and how quickly it can happen, and how quickly you can go from the eye penning a book to the book being penned by the body, or writing you. And of course, I also saw the relation between our work, the river writes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, Sophie, could you say more about the decolonial drive in your work, which you mentioned in the About the Project section? How might eco-poetics work in the service of decolonialism?
Oh God.
Big question there.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't know. I mean, I have no illusions about, like I said earlier, about the capacity and the place of my work in the climate crisis. Just like I don't think that this work really decolonizes, but I think it's a gesture towards thinking about my relations to writing and English being a dominant language, and the inherent claims that are in language and in the words that we've carried forward. I mean, another one of my projects, I'm looking at how language from a book written by 200 years ago or 150 years ago, how that language and that way of thinking is carried forward, a particular kind of territorialization of place. And so I'm conscious of language being claimed, and I'm conscious of me as a settler walking on the river and my position as a settler. And so I was thinking a lot about language and these relations, and how we can't separate ecology. Like I said earlier, we can't separate what's going on with climate change from colonialism and from capitalism and all these other things. And so it's just, I don't know, it was a gesture towards, I think part of one of our problems, the dominant relations, are these claims and knowing and being in a particular position and positioning ecosystems as, something that's constructed to serve us, to conserve capital or to serve, dominant relations. And it is its own thing. It's its own agent, and there are different kinds of relations. It doesn't position a river in that way. And so, in a very sort of way, I guess, I was wondering about how could language be shifted, and what kind of language would we need if we ask the question, what kind of, if we're going to have different relations with an ecosystem, which also means different relations with indigenous peoples and different relations to all kinds of things, what does that language look like? And I don't think we have that language. And so that was another gesture with me sort of decomposing poem to just letters and putting them out there as letters, was because I don't have a language that's decolonized. And I have a colonized brain and a colonized body, and, are not colonized. I'm a settler, and it's very difficult to, I sort of what words are there that don't have a colonial history in the English language? There aren't. So I was it was a gesture towards trying to decompose myself, I guess, and find a gesture towards an opening, a different kind of language, and what could come from that. And I don't have the answer to that. And I don't, like I say, I don't, my work hasn't made any changes in that regard. It's more trying to change the way I think. But I don't have an answer, really.
It's interesting, thank you. I think just even documenting this is part of that as well, the importance of documentation.
And similarly, you don't specifically talk about, decolonization, but you do talk about theft. You use the word theft in the book, and grappling with the edge of not yours. In that case, you're talking about breathing as theft. But are you making connections between bodies in relation to illness and death, but also land and the sense that each breath is a breath stolen from both death and about our presence on this land being stolen? I was just curious about this idea of theft that comes up in the book, and land and breath, and how you're making connections between those.
Thank you for that question. So there are two poems in which I mentioned theft, and one of them is about breath. Something about, can't quote yourself, but because you forget what you write, but something about packing air into lungs, like the duffel bags of thieves, and then the land, the one where I invoke land, land perforated with theft. And I think it's interesting the way you've made these connections across these poems, because it's not necessarily something I thought of when I wrote them. I think in terms of land, living on Indigenous land, I think it's important to, I think it's crucial to recognize that we live on colonized land. We live on land that has been thieved, and that underpins the history of our country. And I think in terms of land almost as its own body as well, like the bodies that are on the land, but also the body of the land itself, which I think resonates also with your project, and the land as a living, breathing thing, and what happens when you thieve that. And then in terms of breath, in that poem, I was thinking about particularly things that can happen to the body where you have shortness of breath, where you're breathless. So things like a panic attack, or things like anaphylaxis, both of which I've experienced, and this idea that, or this feeling that you almost want to gasp more breath, and you can't, and you're almost trying, you become greedy with breath, you're almost trying to steal the breath, and so that's where that idea came from. Whether those two ideas are linked, breath as being stolen from death, and breath and land as theft, I'm not sure. Maybe there's something connecting colonization and illness and death. Maybe they're all in conversation with each other in this work, but like you, I don't know if I have a good answer for that question. Okay, so I think this is my last question for you, Sophie. It's about translation. So, translation seems such a central part of your project. Translation between the seeing eye and the river. Translation, some of these works are titled as translations. The poet and translator Paul Celan described translation as a ferryman's labor, which seems a particularly apt metaphor for your project's fascination with the river. Could you speak to translation in river rights and perhaps to this idea, if it applies, of translation as a ferryman's labor?
Mm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I don't know Celan's work very well, but if I understand correctly, he worked between two languages.
Six or seven, I
Six or
believe.
seven languages, yeah, so it shows how much I know. So I think, as if the ferryman, I would understand in that context of working between two languages, similar to where I felt like I was, I work in English, which is, a settler language, and then there's the land working in its own language, which I don't speak. Like I don't speak river, I don't speak tree, I don't, I was trying to hear it in different ways, but so in a way, it's like, in many ways, my project was an act of translation, trying to move between, but then it was also about me trying to translate, like I was saying earlier, trying to shift, and even like an iota from thinking as as a settler in this settler brain, or in those kind of perspectives in that language, into somewhere else, and how can that translation happen, and that we all need to translate and transition to a different set of relations between us and ecosystems, and between us and um, indigenous settler relations, and there's all these problematic relations, and so I was just thinking about how could I translate as body, and then as also literally my body being there, and how do I translate between an ecosystem through my hand onto the page. So it was very much a lot of translation. And I guess if you think of a ferryman going to shore, it's like moving from one place to another, moving from one language into another, from one understanding into another. But I also see it as not necessarily going to another place. Translation is also, it's a place itself, or it's a third almost for me. Like me being on the river, and in those moments where something was happening between me and the river and these letters, it felt like a third place. I don't know how to say it more than that, but I think when I'm saying that I wanted to be translated, it's to become something entirely different, and something that's between what I know myself as now, me now, whatever that is, and I'm also not a river, but to be something in between, where, and understanding those kind of the porosity of bodies, where I'm not really, we have this idea that we're separate from an ecosystem, but we're not. And for me, we're mostly water in our bodies, and I'm down river, and I'm drinking the water, and it's in and out of me. So in a way, it was trying to understand my body as an entirely different thing than what I might conceptualize it in the day-to-day when we walk around saying, I have this body with these edges. So I was really trying to understand and be translated. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful, thinking of translation as its own third place. And I was just thinking of translation studies, which I've dabbled into a bit, and this idea of going from source text or from original text to target text, and how, it's quite interesting that often this like third place is not spoken of as much.
Mm. Yeah, I thought that language of target text. Wow, that's
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
yeah. There's a violence in that language
yeah,
too.
yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I see it as more movement, back and forth, and like I said, that third place maybe. So I guess I get to ask you the final question.
Thank you.
So religion and saints, spirit snatchers show up in your book. The words degodded, spirit clenched. Is there a tension here? Hope and apathy, religion and spirit. and why clenched? What is this beautiful and uneasy tension?
Okay, thank you for that question, which is a hard question. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to summarize. But I think it's about this idea of the vertical and the horizontal planes meeting, and this title, Spirit-Clenched. There's the spirit, the soul, but then there's also the physicality of the body, which we've spent so much time talking about today, and clenched, this idea of closed, versus openness, and the tension between the two. But in the title Spirit-Clenched, there's also the hyphen between the two, and I think that hyphen is, we're talking about so much about language, I think that hyphen, that punctuation point, which is a part of language, which helps form language, shape language, speak to language in different ways, is also very much a part of that title. Like, it's not just Spirit-Clenched, it's Spirit-Clenched, and that hyphen acts as a point of connection between the two. It reminds that the spirit, the soul, and the body are inextricable. And I think, and I mentioned earlier, it took me kind of a long time to really learn that the body is just as significant, just as necessary as that soul, that spirit, and it has just as large a stake in making meaning in our lives. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think if we'd like, we can share a piece from our works. So I don't know how we're going to do that, but I'm excited to find out.
You can read one of yours. I don't know.
I wanted to read actually the piece from which the title gets its name, probably over time. So it's very short, as are all the poems in this collection. As through cornfields we wade through selves, leaved with fickleness, furrowed with hesitation, Spirit-Clenched, this human homeland. And I'll hand it over to you, Sophie. And I don't know, maybe you want to show some of the images.
I don't know. Well, you don't. I'll show you this one because you didn't get this one, right?
Oh, I didn't. Wow.
So
That's a human body in there.
that's me. So that's me actually submerged in the river, and I have letters, the alphabet in my mouth, and I'm expelling
Wow.
it, and that's about this exchange of letters between back and forth. And I explored with video, and I've got a video poem where the letters are moving in and out, so it's a literal exchange. So yeah, I've been exploring with video. So I can't, I'm not gonna read if I can't read one of these.
But what is reading anyway? And Danny has mentioned we can post the video if you'd like. And that was amazing. Thank you for sharing that one, because I didn't realize that you appear in any of them, which is,
yeah, this is the only,
adds a whole dimension
yeah,
to
it's
the
the only
project.
one. I think that's the only one. Yeah. I can't remember how many there are. I think there are 24 total postcards in the series. So each set of 5 is different. And I think that's the only one of me.
I think ephemerality is so much a part of your work. Like, each one is different. The work, every time somebody orders it, it'll be different. It's very interesting.
Oh, it was really great to talk to you. It's fascinating how much resonance there is between our work.
I agree. I'm really happy we were paired together for this, and it's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, you too.